Hello, okay, so in this YouTube video we're going to look at the exam question: evaluate the view that checks and balances produce more effective government. Now there are a couple of ways you could answer this. You could structure your essay around the different checks, so one set of checks in one paragraph, then in paragraph 2 a different set of checks, okay. Another way is perhaps do it branch by branch. You could do congressional checks on the president in one paragraph, Supreme Court checks on the other two branches in the second paragraph, etc., etc. I do think they're a little bit narrow, those ways, and it does run the risk, I think, of not answering the question about effective government. I think the best way to answer any of these 30 markers, Unit 1, Unit 2 and Unit 3 ones, is to think of themes which are directly linked to that question, which you can then, in this case, compare the different checks and balances from. So thinking about themes for what means or what leads to effective government, I think you could do a theme on the ability of the government to pass effective legislation which benefits the lives of American citizens. You could do one about effectiveness of government being the ability to hold public officials, members of the government to account for decisions which they have made and actions which they have taken. And I think a third way for effective government is that you want a government which can act in a crisis, or act, that could be military or something like that. So I think that'd be the third area. So there would be my 3 paragraphs. And again, I'll keep mentioning this phrase within my essay quite liberally: effective government, okay, and explaining how these checks and balances do or do not produce effective government. Now, what you should do in introduction is have an argument whether you think they do or do not produce effective government. I think I might argue that they don't. Checks and balances are a hindrance, they get in the way of effective government, or perhaps they're not effective enough. Now, equally, you could get full marks by arguing the opposite way, as long as you're dealing with both sides and making these judgments. So, paragraph 1, I thought I'd have a look at legislation. And I'm going to do the method 2 approach of doing the counter argument first. So I'm going to argue that it is effective, and then I'm going to do the not effective for the second half. Again, there are those 2 different ways, remember, of doing these essays. So, effective then. So, checks and balances do allow the government to make effective legislation. And in fact, you could argue that checks and balances allow better legislation to be passed. And within this paragraph, I'm going to start out by explaining this role of the check which Congress has, which is to amend legislation, delay legislation, or sometimes even stop legislation which has been introduced by the executive branch. And what you could argue is that checks and balances encourages bipartisanship when the 2 sides have to come together, and it encourages this compromise. So, for example, Joe Biden in, I think, 2023, maybe in 2024, he passed the Community Gun Safety Act. This piece of legislation had the support of both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. There were some amendments to that legislation by both chambers, but the legislation passed. Sometimes the president might find his legislation is amended by his own party within Congress. So if you look at something like Obamacare, passed in, 2009, 2010, whatever it was, that piece of legislation was amended by the Democrats within Congress. Many of those conservative Democrats who are particularly concerned over abortion and stuff made sure that Obamacare, for example, didn't cover abortion rights. In a similar way, Joe Biden, so notice we had a slightly older example there, talking about Obama and Obamacare, and now I'm going to say in a similar way, we're going to use a Joe Biden example, his infrastructure package and also his Inflation Reduction Act, both these pieces of legislation were amended by Congress. So the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, had quite a lot of green proposals initially. It was quite, some would say, quite liberal in many ways. However, some of those conservative Democrats, in particular Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who represented much more rural states, West Virginia actually has quite a lot of coal industry. He wanted to water down this piece of legislation because it didn't meet the requirements he felt of his constituents. And so he would argue that the changes which he forced on this piece of legislation made it better. Now, many Liberals disagree, but that's an example of Congress amending a piece of legislation, even when it's from the same party, arguably to make it better. That's always a good word to use, that arguably. It covers a multitude of sins. You could argue for another check when it comes to producing good legislation, is the role the Supreme Court has when it comes to using judicial review, sometimes to perhaps protect citizens against bad laws that have been passed by Congress, or laws which are kind of dubious in terms of their constitutionality. So, for example, Congress passed a law a number of years ago called the Defence of the Marriage Act, which basically said that a marriage was defined between a man and a woman. The Supreme Court overturned that with Oberville versus Hodges, which basically allowed homosexual marriage to take place. So there would be an example of the Supreme Court also using its powers of checks on the other branches to ensure better laws. So that's kind of the case for the say that checks and balances are good. They produce effective government, allow the governments to pass laws, etc. However, you could argue that these checks and balances actually have done the opposite. They've been abused, if you like, by the different branches, and they're actually not producing effective government. So, for example, when you've got a united government with the same party in charge of Congress and the White House, you could argue that these checks are quite weak. So, for example, in 2001, following 9/11, there was a national crisis. George W. Bush, as the president, was quite keen to pass a law called the Patriot Act, and it had a number of provisions in there which tried to deal with the threat of terrorism in the USA, allowing the government to listen into people's phone calls much more and act in much more quick ways. This piece of law was passed within 28 days. How much scrutiny took place within those 28 days? And again, it was one party dominated both chambers, and also this national crisis. So it kind of, both those reasons, it was pushed through really quickly. It has been questioned since by some politicians. Sometimes you could say that the checks and balances, especially when you've got divided government, when you've got one party controls one branch and one controls the other branch, or sometimes within Congress itself, sometimes you might find the Democrats control the Senate and the House is run by the Republicans or something. You tend to find that legislation, which might be quite sensible, you might argue, gets blocked purely on partisan grounds. So take, for example, Joe Biden tried to pass what was called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. This piece of law would try to remove some of the barriers which some of the states have imposed on people's ability to vote. Democrats supported it, Republicans refused. And the Republicans had a majority in Congress at the time, and so this law failed. In his last year in office, Joe Biden introduced a series of immigration reforms. Initially, it had the support of both parties. However, when Donald Trump intervened, he didn't want this bill to pass because obviously it was going to be an election issue, and so the Republicans then turned against it, and this piece of immigration reform failed. Again, I would argue that was done on pure partisan grounds, as opposed to a law which could or could not have actually helped the American people. You've also found the Supreme Court and its use of judicial review has sometimes made decisions which have allowed the President to actually circumvent Congress, go around Congress, avoid this check of amending legislation. So, for example, the Supreme Court has allowed the presidency, they've kind of given their approval to DOGE and the big cuts they've made to various government departments, even though it is Congress which has given the money to these departments to do certain jobs. Within this, you could, if you wanted to, talk about vetoes, and you could say the power of the veto is quite weak, which Congress has, which again means the President often gets his own way when he vetoes something. So since 1789, there's been over 2,500 vetoes made by the President, yet fewer than 5% have actually been overturned by Congress. And therefore, if a President vetoes a piece of legislation, basically that's what happens to it. It kind of dies. It's quite rare for it to be overturned. Again, is that giving the president too much power? Just to show that this particular check and balance is quite weak. So there's a number of points there that you can make for this particular paragraph, and I would mention a few different checks and balances within each of these themes. Okay, so theme number 2, which one shall we do? Let's discuss, let's have a think, which one shall we discuss next? Got my notes out. Let's do accountability, holding public officials to account. And again, there's a number of checks and balances we can discuss here. We can discuss the confirmation process held by the Senate, which limits presidential power. We can talk about within here the impeachment, which I suspect most students will be very keen to talk about. And also we've got the Supreme Court's role of judicial review. So again, there's 3 potential checks we can use within this particular theme. So initially I'm going to argue that checks and balances are great, do a good job, and then we're going to do what I think is the better argument to say actually no, checks and balances are a bit rubbish. So for being quite good, you could argue that effective government is promoted, again using that phrase effective government, is promoted or enhanced by the fact that the president can't just appoint his mates to be in the cabinet or into the judiciary. It requires the Senate to confirm these particular appointments, and therefore in theory